Max VelDink is a staff software engineer who's created full-stack web applications for more than a decade. A man of a certain age? No.
It sounds cooler when you say decade instead of, like 9 years.
Yeah, right. His focus is on combining the best of object-oriented and functional philosophies while meditating on novel architecture approaches, especially for Ruby applications. Teaching the next generation of Rubyists is incredibly important to him, and he's currently thinking through modern Ruby courses to replace the Ruby boot camps that have gone out of favor that we were just talking about. So, with that, Max is going to talk to us about the ASMR of refactoring.
All right. Good afternoon. I will try to be as entertaining as possible in the last talk, but it does not bother me if you need to take a nap and get ready for the happy hour. So, refactoring, ASMR of programming talks. All right, and that's it. Well, let's go get drunk. Cool. I'm Max VelDink. I make payroll and tax software at JustWorks. Here's my plug. We're hiring in New York City, Central Florida, if anyone is interested. If you're not, don't tell me about it. I also love open source, so I work on the Ruby SDK for the Open Feature Project, really into Sorbet and some Sorbet extension gems if you like type systems. Cool. So let's dive in. So this is going to be a talk in two parts, heavily inspired by some great refactoring talks from almost a decade ago, if not more than a decade ago now. The first part, we're going to do a refactoring together, have a little bit of that ASMR feeling going on in the back of our heads, and I want you to capture that feeling and find how the refactoring is making you feel. And then we're going to talk about those feelings. It's great. Programmers love talking about feelings, I've found. So the greats. If you don't know who either of these individuals are, at least I think both of them have come up today. I wasn't going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but after JP's talk, I think a few other folks have mentioned it. Yeah, Craig mentioned it. Sandi, Metz, very formative in my career. I read the practical object-oriented book at least once a year and teach it every other year. And Katrina, Owen, both foundational talks just to see their thought process and see how they're doing their refactorings, taking you past the basics and seeing how a working engineer approaches problems. And it's a genre that we were kind of missing. I haven't seen a good refactoring talk in a little while. So we give an internal one, and this is heavily inspired by that. So I highly recommend checking out their stuff. I'll have resources at the end to link out to some of their talks. Cool. So we're going to park here for a second. This code, entirely original, definitely not based on anything I have encountered in the wild. And I'm just going to pause, and we're going to go into the audience participation part of the talk. I want you to go ahead and shout out. I know you need a moment to digest, right, this beautiful code right here. Shout out just some refactoring ideas. If you were told, hey, we're touching this part of the code base, we need to clean it up a little bit, what are some of the things that you would approach first?
Shorten the method.
Shorten the method, yes.
Shorten the constant.
Shorten the constant. Meaningful names. Yes.
Death to ternary operators.
Death to ternaries. That's great. Good. Yeah, multiplying strings. Anyone else? Too many ifs. That one's good too. All right, one more. Early returns. Yes, perfect. Okay, so here's my list. All those great ideas. We won't do all of them, obviously. This is my talk. So inside a class whose public interface is a class level method, right? So we've all encountered this, we've all done this in the sake of expediency, but now that we have an opportunity to refactor, maybe there's some more to the interface of this class that we can discover and try to drive this out a little bit more. Second argument is a symbol that the user needs to know to call, right? So we have some documentation, which is nice, but the domain of symbols is literally anything. So being more explicit about what that operation is could give us some benefits here. Multiple ternary operators, performing the same check. Ternaries are hard to read, doing the same work all the single time. Fourth one's a bonus. You guys don't know this. There's no test for this file. Surprise. Cool. So let's address these. Let's jump in here. First one. You should always do this one first. We're in the Ruby community. You guys know this. So add some tests to add a little bit more coverage here so we can start doing refactoring. At least now we haven't like broken it too bad along the way, right? And there's a little bit of a push-pull here. So I could spend a lot of time looking at the code and figuring out all the different pathways in there. What I chose to do was just do the happiest paths I could find at the bottom and literally just plug in input, see what was popping out, and those are my first two test cases. So using some like very simple RSpec here. I don't know why I'm looking up here. I can see this. We just described the current method that's available. We've got ID for a vanilla order. So if we pass in that symbol with a form object, and then we have a return for an ice cream order. So we pass in that form with a ice cream object. Definitely can tell I work for payroll software, right? So now that we have some sort of test coverage here, let's start to clean up the class level method too. So we'll keep that same module there. There's no reason to really change that. But instead of having just a generic util class, which invites, it's like a magnet for unlike behavior, let's be very explicit about what this piece of code is doing. So we'll call this the recipient ID resolver, which if you can't think of a name, just slap an ER on the end of any noun and you've got your name, right? So we're gonna resolve this recipient ID. Generally, I found util classes are just begging to be their own idea, right? So they kind of started as just a bucket of things while we were moving fast that we just needed to put some either style or decorator pattern like behavior in there. We didn't know where to put some like access queries, something like that. And so they just kind of grow over time. Luckily, we caught this one before it grew to be anything else. But it's got its own idea, so let's go ahead and express that. And they do become a magnet for unlike behavior. So before we start to just glom on things, a new engineer comes, they have a slightly different feature, they're gonna put it in there. Let's start to cut that off and just say, this is what this thing does. Cool. So now let's take a look at some of the supporting code around that. So I've really just moved in large chunks from the original code. So now that we have a class, and we're not using a class level method, we can pass in state, right? So now we'll take in our form here, and we'll pull off the values that we cared about. You probably didn't notice it when I just flashed the big file up there, but we actually only care about these 2 data points. We care who the recipient is, and we care about this Boolean idea of if they're using a bakery ID or not. And then we just expose those with bare words, shout out to Avdi, so we can access those throughout the rest of our class. And next, we have the resolve method that becomes our public interface here, right? So again, I took the comments, put those here as well, and then we still have kind of that nasty flow. We haven't messed with those ternaries at all, but now we can at least read this a little bit more and see what's going on, right? So if we're using that bakery ID, we'll evaluate this ternary and choose either the pretty ID or the non-pretty ID, or the basic ID, I guess. Then we'll see, hey, is that baker ID a placeholder? Then we'll use this scary constant and pull out something from there, and multiply it by an empty space. And then finally, if the baker ID is blank, we'll fall back to some behavior, still using the scary constant, and then do another ternary check at the end to get a value. So you still probably don't know what this is doing, but at least it's doing it inside of a instance method, right? So that's a little bit better. Now we need to update our tests and our call sites throughout the app. So now we have a more RSpec-y test, right? So we'll switch to the subject. So we have the baker ID resolver. It's gonna take in this cake ordering form. We're gonna set up our world a little bit. Not super exciting here, using factory bot and memoization, let constants. And then we're going to describe our resolve method. So still the same 2 tests, but now we're just passing in vanilla. So we're not having to pass in the cake ordering form every single time. And then making sure it equals the bakery ID. And then we'll do the same for the ice cream constant. So nothing really groundbreaking here, but now we at least have that file clean as well. Second thing we're going to look at is the symbol for the second argument. So this is something I see happen a lot, where we want to give some sort of option to our users. but we don't really know how to give them that option. So we kind of fall back to a symbol, assume that we're going to have more and more of these values over time. Typically, we only usually have 2 or 3 at the most options here, and it just becomes like another piece of implicit knowledge we have to impart for callers, right? So instead of having to know the symbol, let's just go ahead and decide to break it into 2 methods that the user can call, right? So instead of cramming more and more into one public API, let's go to 2 and just give 2 options. So at least, at the very least, it's statically self-documenting. And we can delete that constant as well, right? So zooming in on just the resolve for vanilla method, right? We still have the same flow in place, but we've broken out all the ternaries. So every single step is much simpler, right? So we'll just do an early return if we're using the bakery ID. If it's a placeholder, we'll do 9 empty strings or 9 spaces. If it is blank, we'll do the same thing. And then finally, we'll return the bakery ID. And the most satisfying part of refactoring is being able to do this kind of slide where you're just like, look at that. Oh, it's so good. I don't even know what slide I'm on. For the ice cream one, same thing. But we can actually see the parts that are changing now, right? So we have we're doing pretty stuff for ice cream and not for vanilla. And our placeholder value is just empty string for ice cream, right? So now we actually know the things that are changing, which is super useful for our tests. And our tests become more expressive. So they're documenting this new behavior. Now we just have the 2 describe blocks for vanilla and ice cream. Again, we haven't totally driven out all the different use cases here, but we still have the top level public API covered. And then for the multiple ternary arguments, that's just kind of solved, right? So now that we've cleaned up the second argument, that's what was driving the use of the ternaries through the rest of it. So we don't have to worry about that anymore. It's great. We also found the shape of our method, right? The flipping back and forth, which is super nice. So now we can clean it up a bit more and think about how we might reuse it if we get another form in the future that we need to support. So 2 and 3 combined together gives us something like this. We do have constants for the default values, so we get rid of that nasty multiplication of the empty string. And then we've got 2 very alike methods. So you got resolve for vanilla, resolve for ice cream. And they both look the same, and we've just simplified the invalid baker ID check right there. So we'll reuse that part of it, but we'll still keep those 2 public methods available. And this is what I just told you. Okay, so this is where we started, right? So this was the big util class that we got into that we needed to, we were tasked with refactoring, right? This is where we ended. So we got rid of a lot of the comments, a lot of the explanation there, and it is a much more straightforward process here. Now, one thing I will call out, I feel it in my gut, right, is like these 2 methods still look exactly the same and have the same structure. So like, why can't we combine them more, right? And like, why don't we get more private methods down there so that we're not having to do these 2 checks? And I get it, but part of the refactoring instinct too is knowing when we've done enough, right? Like we've set up this file to be much more modifiable in the future, right? So like if we have another form come up, we can see exactly where we'd add another method. We can kind of see the like inputs that we need to give it, right? So what's the default, what's the happiest path, and then what's the guard path. And spending more time with this, I might go ahead and try to like bring those back together into one method. But this is definitely a lot better than this. So knowing when to stop, a very valuable instinct to develop. And then our test suite's a lot nicer, right? So this is the expanded describe block for just one of those methods, right? So now we can actually understand the context that's happening. So when we're using the bakery ID, we'll set up that world, and it'll return the bakery ID. We just have that check. When it's an invalid baker ID, so if we pass that in, we'll go ahead and be able to use the default. And finally, the happiest path that we've been testing the whole time. So that cleans up our RSpec test a lot more as well. Yeah. This is what you should feel like when you like watch this. This is what I feel like when I watch refactoring. It's a feeling that's why we watch like Twitch streamers too, right? And so like this is the feeling that we chase. And a lot of folks are comfortable with this feeling and wanting to feel this all the time. Yeah. Few observations really quick before we talk about the feeling, though. Is it better? Is it better? Yes. Yeah, it's kind of. Like, it's relative, right? Like, did that code ever need to be changed? Probably not, right? Like, was that the first file I looked at my company? Probably. And like, my instinct kicked in. It was like, let's start cleaning this up. Or this is a teaching moment. Like, let me show you how we can start changing this file to be a little bit better. But if we never had another form come down the pike and we never needed to update that behavior and no one ever needed to look at it again, maybe we shouldn't have touched it, right? So it's going to be relative. As a broader point, any refactoring decision you make, someone else will probably disagree with you. And so there's a little bit of nuance there. That's where the nice pull request discussions come in, right? But I think we agree that is in the right direction of more maintainable, easier to understand when folks get there. So that's kind of the North Star to go towards. We have way better visibility if something breaks, right? So now we've distilled the bug cycle here. If we got an issue about this piece of code, then you can kind of look at it and probably figure out what's going on. Like, it's either a weird default or there's a data issue coming in from somewhere. You don't have to decipher that original file to actually figure out what's going on here. Clearly seeing the code paths in the public method makes it more refactorable in the future. So now we see the flow everywhere, and we see what we can do in the future if we wanted to add more behavior. And then it's really easier, or it's much easier to reuse it, right? So one of the things as our code bases grow and you have more and more foreign engineers coming into the code base, you get this feeling of, we don't quite understand how that bit of code works, and so we're not going to use it. We're just going to go build the same thing over here, right? And so either folks are afraid to modify it to do one more thing that they need, or they just originate new code somewhere else, and that just increases your sprawl. So now we're just inviting folks like, hey, come use our happy little class here if you need to resolve this ID quickly, right? Cool. Now, how are we feeling, right? Hopefully you felt like Margot Robbie. Is it like crunching into a nice juicy pickle, which this just makes my skin crawl, but like some people, that's your thing, right? Do you feel like chalk on a chalkboard when you drag that piece of chalk down? Also makes my skin crawl. Like watching your favorite streamer, right? Like watching someone play, I don't know what people play, Fortnite, Call of Duty, right? Headshots, you know? Watching The Office, rewatching Friends, doing whatever you do. Yeah, so my call to action here, don't just watch or don't just seek that ASMR feeling, right? I got trapped in this cycle a lot when I was, I guess you would call me like a mid-level engineer, right? So when I knew there was stuff I didn't know, and I knew that other folks, I wanted to emulate what they were doing, but just watching what they were doing online, I was hitting a plateau of what I was able to actually transition in my own work, right? So move from passive consumption to active participation, right? Exercise your refactoring muscles, right? I mentioned that might have been the first code that I ever saw where I was working at, and it's okay, right? Like, I think it is okay mentally on a branch locally just to take through and try to like examine why you feel like that code needs to be refactored, or like what instinct is kicking in for the ick, right? Or for the code smell, right? Like what are you gonna solve? Learn code smells. Sandi Metz has a great talk on, I believe it's called Get a Whiff of This from 2016, I believe, which is a great compliment to this talk. Well, this talk's a great compliment to that talk. The design code smell books, Feathers, Michael Feathers, Uncle Bob, all those, lots of great resources here to learn the code smells and learn the matching refactoring recipe. And don't be afraid to just try a refactor in your own code with the intent to throw it away, right? So that code, spoiler alert, that we just refactored together, we did not change in our production code base, right? We used it as a teaching reference, and we have given that talk a few times. But that code remains the same as it was, and it still does its thing every quarter, right? And that's what we need it to do. And finally, just some like advice for leveling up here. So one thing I tell my team a lot is the art of getting better and like increasing your craft in software engineering is just developing 100 different instincts, right? So when you're a junior, everything's new. So you're learning a new lesson every 5 minutes. It's overwhelming. As you like ascend and as you go into mid or senior, and now you're like running your own projects, you know how to make something work, right? And you know how to deliver on a project. But then you start to develop the instincts of, well, this doesn't feel right to me. Or like, we delivered this project 6 months ago, and now everyone's already making fun of it and talking about tearing it up because we got to redo, or we got this one ticket that we need to add. And like, why did that happen? And being like self-reflective there and trying to figure out like, oh, okay, what I'm feeling is we didn't use the null object pattern, right? Or what I'm feeling is we couldn't handle this data access requirement or something like that. And figure out like why it happened, and there's probably a matching code smell that you can put some language around, and then just the instinct just kicks in. It's like, oh, it's this. Like, this is why we shouldn't do it today. Knowing why something feels better, right? So just being lost in the cloud of like, this just doesn't feel right, until you can start like naming a thing, that gives it a little bit more power and a little bit more like, okay, well, I can name it, and now I know what to do about it. Or I can name it, and now it's easier for me to make the decision today to not do it, right? Or to prevent something that's going to hurt in 6 months. And this is why it's going to hurt in 6 months. And knowing when to stop is a really useful muscle, right? So there's refactoring to learn. There's refactoring because you have a ticket and you want to do a little bit of cleanup before you implement a behavior. All fantastic, but knowing when you would just be polishing, something that gets used once a year and no one needs to look at, very important to know when to stop. And finally, don't fall to the temptation of the greenfield, right? Like, we all want to work in greenfield projects, right? We all want to Rails new something, be able to do Hotwire and et cetera, like all the cool new stuff. You don't actually learn a lot of stuff there, right? You learn architecture and you learn design, and those are great things that you should be learning, and hopefully you're applying lessons in the greenfield. But I have learned far more having to support legacy applications that have been around for 15 years, right? Or having to decide between implementing a behavior, designing a new subsystem, or thinking about doing a greenfield project, right? And so it's not all green on the greenfield, because as soon as you have the first commit there, you own legacy code, right? And someone else is going to make fun of you. So you might as well get used to editing someone else's legacy code so they can't make fun of you, right? Yes. And then finally, just a couple more resources. If you want to increase your refactoring muscle. I realized the irony when I told you guys not to just watch stuff, and then I'm just going to recommend a bunch of stuff to watch. So I get it. Therapeutic refactoring. I think someone said this earlier. Did you mention? Yeah, JP mentioned this. This is a great talk. This is like one of my foundational ones. Her name is Katrina Owen, not Owens. But I rewatch this talk like once a month, really, to kind of like just re-inspire me. It's one of the first things I recommend to most folks. Get a Whiff of This by Sandi Metz from, I think, RailsConf 2016. Really great talk about code smells, why they're important to learn, what to do about them. She makes a lot of great reference to a lot of the work done in the early 90s, early 2000s, which are still great. Practical Object-Oriented Design in Ruby, or POODR, as affectionately called. Best book, seminal work. Just read it. It'll just make you better overnight. 99 Bottles of OOP, very similar book, very fun book club book to do. And then finally, the seminal Refactoring, Improving the Design of Existing Code. That thing is dense. It is worth reading it, but probably not all at once. So the way I approached it was I just took a year. And so like, if you're from like a Christian background, there's like devotionals where it's just like read one thing every day. So like my devotional was like, I'm gonna read a refactoring recipe every week. And it did not have the same spiritual benefits, but I learned a lot by going through there. And finally, cool. That's it.